Hi everyone, and welcome to our Goat Roadshow webinar tonight. We've got an exciting topic of genetics. My name's Dr. Melanie Smith, and I'm the project manager for the sheep and goat R&D portfolio here at MLA. We've got a wonderful lineup of speakers for you tonight to listen to. First of all, I'd like to just quickly introduce our first speaker. We've been really fortunate enough to have Peter Bradley come in from MLA Sheep Genetics today. Peter is the project manager for sheep genetics and has a strong background in genetics and works with the sheep genetics team. I'll introduce Peter and off you go, Peter.
Thanks very much, Mel. I'm taking everyone can hear me and see my screen. So as Mel said, I'm the manager with the sheep genetics team and have been tasked, we've got a great lineup of speakers this evening. So I've been tasked to give a bit of an overview on KidPlan. You might be wondering why I'm here talking about goats and my title is sheep genetics, and I hope to articulate a little bit more about how we deliver the national genetic evaluation for goats. So just as a bit of an overview of my presentation, first of all, just cover off what actually is KidPlan and who's responsible for what as part of the delivery pipeline for genetic evaluation for goats in Australia. Then I'll set the scene a little bit and we'll hear more about it this evening, about why we actually want to define the genetics potential of an animal using breeding values. Why is that important? And then finally, how we actually use those tools in practice. So what is KidPlan and who is who? So if we think about the genetic space, and I've just thrown a heap of terms on the slide there that you can see that I guess we associate with genetics. And sometimes these terms can get confused and it is a complex space. So we're talking about KidPlan genetics, estimated breeding values, throwing in MLA, sheep genetics, ASBVs. What do all these words and terms have to do with how we deliver genetic evaluation for goats? So I guess my coming slides will try and articulate how we actually go about providing tools or genetic selection tools for you to use as part of your breeding programs. So as Mel said, this is one of our MLA goat webinar series. And I guess who are the players in the genetic space? So MLA, Meat Livestock Australia, is a big player in not just livestock genetics. We do invest in livestock genetics research and development, but Mel is actually the project manager for broader research and development relating to sheep and goat production. So we invest in those areas. But as part of MLA, there's actually a business unit that I'm involved in called sheep genetics. And we're all part of MLA, but our responsibility at sheep genetics is to deliver the genetic evaluation for both sheep and goats. And the terms that we have for those, so this is where KidPlan comes into it, we're responsible for the delivery of the KidPlan product through and KidPlan EBVs or estimated breeding values. We're also involved in the delivery, as our name suggests, of the genetic evaluations for sheep, which come under the brands of Merino Select and LambPlan. And the reason we can do it across species for both sheep and goats is that our software actually allows us, genetic evaluation is very similar regardless of the species. And our software and development that's been done to develop the analytical software, so the stuff that crunches the numbers, is very similar, and we've adapted that to be able to deliver KidPlan EBVs to industry. So that's all well and good. We've got KidPlan EBVs that we can use for selection, but do you have to be a member of KidPlan to use them? How does that part work? And that's kind of what I'm going to try and talk through now. So I guess there's two different categories of users of KidPlan or EBVs. And that's the seedstock breeders or buck, the people that breed bucks and sell those. And we'll hear from Colin Ramsey later on this evening, and he definitely falls into that category. So if you're a seedstock buck breeder or seller, you actually send your on-farm information. So data that you've captured, and I'll talk a little bit more about what types of data are captured generally, but you send that data to us at Sheep Genetics or to KidPlan, and then we provide those estimated breeding values back to you for your business. So you can make selection decisions, but you can also sell bucks using those EBVs. The other category you might fall into is the buck purchaser. So you actually go out annually and actively seek bucks to bring back in to improve the genetic merit of your herd. So if this is the case, you actually don't have to send us any data. You can use those EBVs to make selection decisions to drive genetic progress within your herd. And then, of course, we've got the interaction that you might have with your seed stock breeder that is supplying data to us. So they might be sending you catalogues, etc., that have these KidPlan EBVs published. So you don't actually have to be a member of Sheep Genetics or a member of KidPlan to use EBVs. These EBVs are available for you to look at from these seed stock breeders that are supplying us with the data. And I'll talk a little bit more later on about how we go about accessing and using those EBVs that are really on your fingertips at the moment, because you can access them quite easily through your mobile device. But I guess just taking a step back, I wanted to cover on why we actually want to use breeding values in the first place. And for those that don't know me, I'm a little bit of a car nut. So I'm currently just actually rewatching all the episodes of Top Gear. And there is one memorable episode that I like to use as a bit of an analogy for genetics. And that is that it's a bit like a car. It's about what's under the hood that actually matters. That's what you're buying. When you go and purchase a buck, it's about the genes that animal carries. And there's this one memorable episode of Top Gear. I'm not sure if anyone is a fan that's on the webinar this evening, but it's where the British Top Gear presenters actually challenged the Australian Top Gear presenters for a drag race. The conditions of the drag race is that you must use a vehicle that tradies in your country use. So, of course, naturally, the Aussies rock up with a V8 Commodore Ute, and they think they've got it in the bag because the Poms rock up with a Ford Transit van. But this is where my genetics analogy comes in that I don't think the Aussies would have been so confident if they actually knew what was under the hood of the Ford Transit van that the Pommies rocked up in, which was a twin turbo Jag V6 motor that was actually putting out 542 horsepower compared to the 380 from their Ute. So naturally, the Poms won that drag race. But coming back to genetics, it's the same thing. What you see is not always what you get. It's important to know about the genes that animal carries that it's going to pass on to its progeny. So to think about that, if you're going to purchase a buck on sale day, using that car analogy, what you're actually purchasing are the genes to take home and put into your herd. The physical animal that you look at on sale day, there's a lot of things that could influence what it looks like. So a few examples are, how much was it fed? Was it preferentially fed compared to the sale down the road? The age of the buck, was it born earlier or later over the kidding period? Was it born a single or a twin? We know that has a big influence, and that influences an animal's performance right out till later life. So even though that buck might be 12 months of age when you're purchasing him, the fact that he was born a single or a twin, which has got nothing to do with his genes, will influence, how big he might be appearing. We also know the age of the doe impacts how an animal will perform. So if she's had a couple of kids before and she's got good mothering ability, that's better than a maiden doe that's having kids for the first time. So all those things can influence what an animal looks like. So they're what we call the environmental factors. But as I was saying, he's not going to pass any of those on to his progeny. Just because he might look good because he's a single, he's actually not going to pass that on unless it's described in his genes, which is the bit that we're interested in. And this is what estimated breeding values really describe. So how do we actually disentangle all those different, what we call environmental or fixed effects to calculate a breeding value? And this is where it comes into what our seed stock buck breeders are supplying us, or the data from on-farm that we use the genetic evaluation to then create these breeding values. So things that we take into account is that animal's own performance. So this might be like a raw record, like a weight. We look at the performance of his sire and his dam. So because we're wanting to know more about the genes the animal carries, we're wanting to know about the performance of other related individuals. So we look at those. We also look at the sibling performance. So any half siblings, are they also growing well? Because that's going to help us describe those genes. We also look at things like correlated information. So we know some traits are correlated. A really good example is birth weight is correlated with growth rate. So we take into account those correlations. We also take into account something called heritability. Now, heritability describes how much of what you're seeing is due to genetics or due to the environment. So a really good example of a trait that's moderately heritable, so it's influenced a fair bit by genes and a fair bit by the environment, is a trait like growth. Whereas a trait that might be what we call lowly heritable is something like reproduction, where we know the environment is having a bigger influence. Just because a trait's lowly heritable doesn't mean we can't make genetic progress. It actually means breeding values is even more important, because you can't just select on the visual or phenotypic performance of that animal alone. We need the breeding value to account for the genes. Other things that we also consider is the environment that animal was raised in. So the breeders that or the seed stock producers are supplying us with things like, who was this animal managed with? What animals can we compare this animal to? What are its contemporaries? And then finally, in the future, I think we see this already in our sheep evaluations, but genomics also comes in, and we can use that to help describe an animal's breeding values, but we need to do some more research and development and data capture to enable that. But that's an exciting area in the future. So that's a bit of a touch point on, I guess, who are the players and why we actually need breeding values and what information we need to calculate those. So how do we use this in practice? So if we're thinking about the flow of information, I spoke briefly about, what are seed stock breeders doing, and what are if you're purchasing bucks, what is the flow of information? So if we think about our seed stock buck sellers and breeders, they have their on-farm data that I spoke about, all those different things, pedigree, records, all of those kind of things. They send that data to us at Sheep Genetics. We crunch the numbers with our partners at the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit based in Armidale at the University of New England. So we calculate the breeding values and we deliver back a KidPlan EBV. With that KidPlan EBV, our buck breeders and sellers, they use that to make selection decisions. They choose, okay, which bucks do I keep and use again? Which young bucks do I bring in and use as a sire to make those mating decisions? Those mating decisions occur again, and we go and collect another lot of on-farm data. So that cycle continues. And we're making genetic progress because we're using EBVs to make those selection decisions. And then from a buck purchaser perspective, you don't have to worry about capturing that on-farm data. You can just use those EBVs as part of your selection decision. So how do you access them? The great news is that we already have a number of members that you can find on our search site. So I've included the link up there. I've got some screenshots here on where to find this information. This is from desktop. It's also compatible with mobile. So you can jump on and have a look through these features. So this is our search site. And you can see here, I'm a breeder. You can select what type of user you are. And then you can also search what you want to look at. So obviously for tonight's webinar, we're interested in goats. So by selecting goats, that filters down the search that we're just looking for breeding values on goats. We're not worried about any of the other sheep breeds that might be in there. The other great thing about our website is that you can log in and register. So it's free to register, and you can register even if you're a commercial producer. And what that allows you to do is if you do any searches or put any criteria in, you can actually save that search and come back and log in at a later date and find those animals that you're looking at and find those breeding values. So that's a really good functionality. It's totally free. It takes you about a couple of minutes to register an account with Sheep Genetics. Once you've done that, or you don't even have to do that, you can use the site without logging in, but you just can't save searches and come back and review them later. We also have a section for sale catalogues and semen catalogues. So this is only from today, actually, this screenshot. So we've actually got 5 current semen catalogues that you can click on there and go and search. And when sale season comes up, you can also find sale catalogues there. There's another area of recommended searches. So these are just some pre-selected criteria. You can go and alter the criteria, but if you're looking to just get started and use the site for the first time, this is a great way to quickly find some animals by using those. Once you've done a search, you'll get taken to a page that looks something like this. And this is where we display, you can see the left-hand column there is our animal IDs. And I've hidden the stud name, but you can see any stud that's publicly listed on our website. Across the top, these are our different traits and the different trait categories that we have available. So you can change these by clicking Customize ASBVs, or if you want to find out a little bit more about what PWT might mean, you can click the info icon next to it and it'll explain that that's post-weaning weight and why that trait might be important. And then the numbers under that, you can see there's the breeding value, which is the big number, the accuracy of the breeding value, and then sometimes there's you'll see the top 5, top 10, top 20% shadings. That refers to where does that animal sit relative to other goats. So taking that top line, for example, you can see the Seed Plus, which is the Carcass Plus index. That animal's actually in the top 5% for all goats for that index. So you can actually see where that animal sits relative to other goats available. You can also, I think I did see a question come through pre-webinar of someone that must be familiar with BreedPlan. So that's the cattle version of Sheep Genetics. And they said something about different graph views that are available in BreedPlan. So if you're a bit more of a visual person and you're really not sure what a number of 5.4 for P weight might mean, you can change the display there where it says data display. It's currently set at data view, but there's another setting there, graph view, which actually displays the percentiles on a graph, which is, if you're new to EBVs, is a really good way to get an understanding of where an animal sits, what traits that buck might be good for, or where he might be lacking. So that's a great place to start. So I'll hand back to Mel now, but just before I do, thanks again for the opportunity. And I just thought I'd take this time to quickly summarise from a KidPlan perspective where I see the real value being. So obviously we provide those estimated breeding values through KidPlan by people that submit data to Sheep Genetics. Those breeding values that we provide back, or EBVs, allow you to look under the hood using that car analogy I spoke about before, about what genes an animal will pass on to its offspring. And really recommend jumping on and having a look. If you're new to EBVs or understanding KidPlan, jump onto the search site either on your computer or on your mobile and have a browse around. And if you do have any questions about using KidPlan, please contact us at Sheep Genetics, and I'm sure Mel will distribute some contact details later on. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Peter. That was a really great overview and a great introduction into genetics, into the goat industry. Next up, we've got Professor Lo Hoffman.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me clearly? Okay, just give a note. Thanks. So I'm going to be sharing some of the reports and comments that I received from the questionnaire that I sent out on KidPlan, the survey around what producers and seedstock breeders think about KidPlan. The questionnaire is still open. At the end of my talk, there will be opportunity for others who would like to share their views about this to put in their data. It'll take you about 10 minutes. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands in which we meet today, and pay our respect to their ancestors and their descendants. One of the questions why we are attending this webinar, and I think it's because we all want to improve the genetics of our goat herd. But then the question comes up, what do we want to improve? And typically we want to improve those attributes that increase our profitability. And they vary. They could be anything from reproduction, kid survivability, litter size, or decrease the number of empty days, or it could be the growth weight, and that could include birth weight, weaning weight, or slaughter weight, or days to slaughter. Or some of us might be even more focused on the carcass, the level of fat. Goats, we have a great commodity here that is lean and healthy, so we don't want too fat goats, so we want to look at fat, but we might want more muscle, more meat on the carcass, so then we would look at something like egg muscle weights. Or it could be that we worried, and I see a question came through about worm egg counts. So we could also start looking, because the resistance to worms is heritable, although it's not that highly heritable, but you can still select goats that are more resistant than their counterparts to worm infestations. So we know that genetically superior bucks, on average, that are genetically superior, will give us kids that grow quicker and thus reduce the time to slaughter, or kids that meet the carcass specifications that we need if we select for those carcass traits, or daughters with higher milking potential and greater fertility. So selecting the right buck will influence the amount of milk that his daughters, the does, will produce, which is of course important for kid survivability and the weaning weight of kids. And then on the other hand, the genetically superior does on average produce more kids, a birth, and you can also select for those that survive to weaning, kids with higher growth rates, again, kids with higher carcass weight and value, and then those with a higher maternal weaning weights provide goat breeders with more opportunity to produce Capretto carcasses at an earlier stage. So one of the things we need to start thinking about is not just how many kids am I weaning or sending off, but we need to also look at the economics, and the economics actually tells us we need to look at the kg of meat per surface area per time unit that we market, because that's where the profitability lies when we produce this. It's not how many kids I can load on the truck, it's what's the weight of all those kids, how long did it take them to reach there, and is it on the maximum carrying capacity of my property. But while we look at these, we mustn't forget other traits or abnormalities, such as feet, udder, teats. We need to keep those in mind as well. So how do we know which buck doe is superior? If I look at these Kalahari reds in a trial that I ran in a feedlotting, which one of those is going to perform better? Is it the one with the white stomach, back, or the one to its right, or the one hiding behind? So it's a difficult question, isn't it? So is it superior because it looks bigger than the rest? But how do you know it's not bigger because it's maybe older? Or because my neighbor says it's a good one? Or the breeder is good, trustworthy? Or is it because the breeder is my friend and therefore he's going to produce good goats? Or because I like the color? Because it looks tame? Because. So none of these are actually the right answer, isn't it? What determines how, the question then is, well, what determines then which buck or doe is superior? And that is its own genetics that we've heard about. But we've got to be careful with genetics. When we look at animals, we also got to take into consideration its age. If you buy a young 10-month-old buck and you start comparing him to a 16 or 18-month-old buck, the 18-month-old buck is going to look more muscular because of the growth and development that takes. A 8 to 10-month-old buck is still in his growth phase. He hasn't the growth, and his growth phase is still around the legs, getting length and getting length. He hasn't really filled out yet. And so be very aware of when you start looking at an auction and the goats come in there, be aware that the bigger one might just be bigger because he's older than the others. And then also the environment. And in the environment, what is important there is you need to, the environment will influence how it reacts, but the influence of how it reacts to the environment is a genetic one. So you need to take that into account. And a part of the environment that you need to take into account is actually the feed. And when you go to buy goats from a seedstock breeder, you need to take into account, does he feed out of the bag or is it off the felt? Because that will influence what the animal looks like. But all of these doesn't answer the question, how will its progeny perform in the same environment or in different environments? In fact, we do not know which is superior by just looking at the animal. So we need data. We need to measure, but what do we measure? It's things like weight, birth, weaning, slaughter, mating, pregnancy status, body characteristics. But remember, before we measure, we need to identify the individual. So what we measure depends on our breeding goals. But how do we know how the offspring will perform? And that's where the estimated breeding value comes in. So as mentioned, the EBVs allow us to evaluate an animal's genetic potential for a range of traits that directly impact on the profitability of your goats. So, and as mentioned, they are calculated from analysis of pedigree and performance information. And this has already been covered. So how do they work? Let's just take that same record that we showed earlier on. This is just a printout of that. So, and it helps you to benchmark what is a better trait. So PWT is the weight of an animal post-weaning, at the post-weaning age stage, and it's a unit kg. So if I look at the top 5%, that's 3.5 above. So that's 3.5 above the average, and the top 50% is 0.8% above. So we'll call that buck A and buck B. So if I take the top 5%, right, and my assumption is that we're working on a 48% dressing percentage and $10 per kg carcass. So on the middle column is buck A's, and the one on the right is buck B's average. So the estimated breeding weight is 3.5 kgs. Okay, and remember the buck passes half his genes to his offspring. So theoretically, that buck, if I use him, I should get 1.7 kgs more for his offspring than the average of that herd that he came out of. And then, so that equates to a 0.84 kgs heavier carcass compared to a 0.2 kg of buck B. And that value is $8.40 per kid versus $2 per kid. But a buck on average should give me 60 kids that are marketable. So it's 504 against 120. And I would typically use a buck for 4 years in my herd. So that gives me 2,000 versus 480. So that buck, selecting that buck that came out of the top 5% with a EBV value for faster growth rate post-weaning, end of the day, I will get $1,500 more from his progeny. Let's take another one. So number of kids weaned. So buck A is the top value, 7% higher. It's made a breeding value compared to buck B, which is the average. So top buck has a number of kids weaned 7% compared to buck 0. So again, 3.5% for every daughter sired. So the average buck gets 60 progeny per year, of which half females, that's 30 does per year. And over 4 lifetimes, that'll be 4-year lifetime that I've used them. That's 120 daughters more. And so that ends up around 20 extra kids or $5,000. So instead of 100 daughters, he'll give me 120, right? So I've taking a maiden doe at $250 each, that'll give me $5,000 more. So putting these two together will make a difference. So if I have 1,000 does using average bucks, I'll be marketing 1,200 kids of an average carcass weight of 15, and the total value that I'll get in is 180,000. But if I use the same 1,000 does and I use the top bucks and I take into account both just those traits of the fast post weaning growth as well as the fertility, I'll be marking 42 kids more. They'll also be heavier, right? 42 kids from the genetics of the estimated breeding value of the fertility. And then the carcass will be 1.75 kgs heavier because of the genetic potential for faster post-weaning growth, which will give me a total value of 208,000. So just by selecting the correct buck will give me an advantage of $28,000 over that value of that buck will be. So when there's a breeding objective that requires emphasis to be placed on more than one trait, then we use a selection index to give a combined estimated breeding values. And there are two indexes available that we could use. The one is the boat dollar index, and these are just some of the parameters that are weighed, and the other is a carcass plus index. But if you aren't comfortable with these indices, I would suggest that you talk to someone who's more knowledgeable in genetics to guide you. Because in the questionnaire, some of the responses that came back, amongst others, was I have a total free range herd, and I cannot see how estimated breeding values will give any value to my business. Well, I hope I've showed you by looking at the different better growth rate percentage that it will pay back. But there's a lot of questions around because at the moment an uncertainty, because I think the goat industry is in a transition phase from basically feral free range into a more scientifically managed system. And although goats are goats, they're not sheep, right? And they're not cattle. Some of the principles that we apply when we select cattle and rams in our sheep and bulls in our cattle, those same principles apply to goats. And there are some basic things you need to think about when you go looking for an improved goat to bring into your herd. And these should include things about structurally sound. You will define what is structurally sound, but take into account the type of terrain farm you have. Depending on the type of soil you have will determine how much emphasis you need to put on hooves, particularly if you're quite extensive and your goats have to move around a lot. The other one is when you bring in your new goats, have a quarantine camp where you can keep them in, and also get more information from the person selling the goats. You need to know what vaccinations were used, what internal parasite treatments, drenching had been used and when it had been used. Obviously, if you're going to be looking at a goat for breeding purposes, you will look at scrotum circumference and ask for that. You might even, depending on the price you're paying, but you might even want to ask that you need a proof of semen quality and fertility. It's no good buying a goat that isn't fertile. In South Africa, we did some research on some of the goat breeders, and we found that 40% of the bucks being used in the herd were actually infertile. Keep in mind, if you buy in a young buck, don't let him loose out in a large territory and expect him to be able to dominate a 7-8-year-old buck that he's got to fight against. So think about your strategy. If you are looking up at bringing in improved genetic material and you're a more free range, extensive system, think of a strategy that you could use to maximize the value that you get out of that goat without jeopardizing his performance. The other question I sometimes get asked is, well, how many does can a buck, what is the ratio that I need? How many does can a buck service? I would say a young buck, I would give him around 20 to 30, not more. And in his second year, go up to 30, 40. And then from there up to 60. Some people are pushing and saying a buck can mate up to 100 does. But I think I would be comfortable to look at about a 4%, maybe, maybe 2%. So that's of mature bucks. So 2% bucks to your doe ratio, and that should do it. Some of the other questions that I'm asked is, should I have a breeding season or not? I'm a strong believer in having a breeding season because it's easier to manage. And part of the management, if I'm looking at improving the genetics of my herd, is to get rid of the young weaner bucks, because goats reach sexual maturity at an early age. And if I don't wean at the right time, I'm going to have a young buck jumping and mating with his mother, sister, or his other close linked progeny. And that will just increase the inbreeding value of my herd, which will be very negative as well in the long run.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Lo. That was a great presentation and really insightful. Next up, we have Colin Ramsey. Colin's been involved with breeding meat goats in Australia since the mid-1990s, soon after boar goats were first introduced from South Africa. He's got extensive knowledge with putting boar bucks over rangeland nannies, and currently turns off KidPlan related progeny seed stock for commercial producers from him and his son's farm at West Wyalong in New South Wales. Colin, if you can please share your screen. And just while Colin's doing that, I encourage everyone to pop their questions in the Q&A down the bottom, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. Thanks very much, Colin. Over to you.
Hello, everybody. This is Colin Ramsey. Thanks for the introduction. I've got 20 minutes to tell you about a case history here of our operation, which is 20 years. So I thought, well, we'll have 20 slides as well. So we'll trip quickly through it. And what I want to touch on as we go through is, first of all, a quick wrap up of the case history, where we started, where we are now. The journey's not over. What have we learned through that time about productivity? What are the key things that help your turnoff and your profit? It's basically applying KidPlan to your selection is basically a crossing up process. And that's what a lot of people are setting out on now. So I want to tell you what we learned about crossing up. And then through the whole of that process, KidPlan has been, was fundamental to the evolution of the whole business. So I'll touch on how that helps. Just to mention what's not a topic here is that, as Peter pointed out, there are a whole lot of non-genetic environmental factors, and they reflect in structure and appearance and breed, all sorts of things like that, which do not fall under genetics, and they are not subject here. So they're dreadfully important. You have to think about all that side of it, but this is about genetics. So let's look at the case history, and this is the beginning. Now, I love this picture, partly because it predates even digital photography. So I apologize for the quality, but this is 1999. One of our first loads of rangeland nannies from Cobar or Ivanhoe or somewhere. And here's the first group of boer bucks from Tarawena getting their eye around them for the first time. So that's a memorable picture in our story. So after that, you start off with great excitement, but the story actually evolves really pretty slowly and there's enormous persistence and patience required. In our case, we started in 99. We were going by 2001 until 2005, probably a few years we were selling direct prime kids. It all seemed pretty straightforward and simple. Then for those of you who remember the big drought in the bicentennial drought, we spent 7 or 8 years fighting for existence through that. Prices collapsed, live export market evaporated, the Aussie dollar went over a parity, and the world basically fell apart. Through that period, we were wrestling with all sorts of production and husbandry problems, and we started to realize that fundamental to everything was genetics. So we went looking for a genetic solution and found KidPlan, which had pretty much died at that point. From about a couple of years after that, KidPlan started to make a difference. In 2013, we ran a buck trial on these crossbreds, bringing in sires from all over the place. In about 17, one of the biggest decisions we had to make along the way was to stop using full-blood bucks and to switch across to using purebred bucks, which are basically boars infused with genes from rangeland animals. And the reason we were basically forced to do that is that we found the genetic performance of the purebreds was outstripping any full-bloods we could find. So we switched over, and that's what we do now. In 18, we ran yet another big embryo transfer program. And now here we are selling EBV rated seed stock from the one location in southern New South Wales. That's the history. It shouldn't take most people as long as that. We made a lot of bad mistakes, and you're welcome to learn from them. You should get there in half the time, I reckon. The first thing to point out is that when you start crossing up, you seem to make progress very, very rapidly. And the reason for that is that the visual appearance of an animal, of your herd, changes extremely fast. So in a couple of years, you can transform a rangeland herd, if that's what you start with, into whatever phenotype you've decided to go with. So there we started in 99. This one here with the horse, that's 2006. We already had some, reasonable looking animals there. A little bit rangeland in the frame, but otherwise okay. And on the right, that's 10 or 12 years later of continued breeding. So those animals on the right are genetically streets ahead of the ones on the left, but except to the trained eye, visually there's not that dramatic a step forward. So don't be fooled that when your visuals are progressing, your genetics is necessarily coming along at the same pace. Now I'll come back to productivity, but behind all the visual improvements that we were excited about, productivity improvements followed. And once we got in the groove to do that, and with KidPlan guiding us, it turned out that productivity improvements across the board were pretty dramatic. So I've just picked one here, which happens to be the 9-month-old weights of our does, of the average doe herd. So we started thinking about KidPlan here in 2008. It started to take impact by the 2010 when we had the first generation of improved bucks. And as you can see, there's very substantial improvements in in performance across the board continuously until now. So visual improvements will follow, productivity improvements will follow visual improvements, but it does come, it just requires persistence. Here's another couple of charts on the production improvement. That one on the left is the eye muscle depth from 2012 across to 21, so that's 10 years. And I won't bother you with how significant those numbers are, but as an average across a herd, that is a substantial difference in eye muscle depth. And the other one there on the right is exactly the same thing for yearling weight across the herd. The blue ones are all the males, the red ones are all the females, so not much differentiation in the genetic improvement between males and females. When you get down to more individual examination, there are differences, but as a herd, they tend to perform very similarly. So that brings us to productivity. Let's take a deeper look at productivity. And what we've learned over the years after starting with a shotgun approach and no idea about what was important and probably 30 or 40 or 50 different EBVs that we could consider, we now know, and it's proven externally as well, that there really are 3 or 4 things that you must primarily focus on if your breeding objective is production. There are many other breeding objectives, but if your breeding objective is production and turn off and profit, by far the #1 influence on that result is reproduction. And of reproduction, the survival of your kids is by far the biggest component of that. Now, it's a bit frustrating that that's the case because, first of all, nobody's quite figured out what influences survival most of all, and there's a lot of work being done on that. And the other thing is that reproduction in general, as Peter pointed out, has fairly low heritability. So though it's the biggest problem, it's one of the hardest to actually to rectify and improve, but there's a lot of work being done on it at the moment. The next most important key to your production and profit is growth rate. In other words, how quickly can you get your turn-off animals to whatever target weight your market requires. Now, growth rate, again, as Peter said, has fairly high heritability. It's correlated to a lot of things. You can work it out from some very elementary measurements. So you're probably going to make more progress with growth rates in the first instance than with reproduction, even though it's less important. Muscling is the next thing for all the obvious reasons. Eye muscle and fat just give you a better carcass and also tend to help with reproduction. So eye muscle depth measurements are very important. And then lastly, if you are in worm country, then worm resistance probably jumps straight to the top of the list. If there's one most horrendous threat which will chuck you out of the industry in disgust, it's worm control in bad worms area. So it is really, really an important thing, though most of the production in Australia comes from areas where worms are not normally an issue. So that's what drives your production and profit. There's no escape. It's reproduction, growth rate, muscling, and worms if you're in that area. Now, I want to touch first just briefly on reproduction. And here's the famous quote, which people tell me over and over again: our goats give us 200% per annum. And I hear that so many times. for years and years and years, I struggled because I could never get anywhere close to it. And I know now that there are some systems where you can generate that, but very frequently it's statistically just wrong. And when the New South Wales DPI did a formal study of a dozen operations, commercial operations in New South Wales and Queensland a couple of years ago, and measured everything properly and did it all properly, this is the results that they got. This is the number of kids marked per doe scanned. Okay, number of kids marked per doe scanned. Not strictly a weaning rate, but in some sense a fertility fecundity rate. Okay. Half the dozen enterprises that they studied were between 40 and 60% kidding rates out of the does scanned. I can't remember precisely what the does scanned, but they would certainly have probably scanned 180 to 200%, I'd suggest. So there for those people, there was a massive drop from scanning, from number of fetuses to kids weaned. The other half dozen got between, let's call it 100 to 130, 140%, which is a much more common and realistic number. So for a weaning rate, unless you are running some very specialized systems, something like 150% is an excellent target rate to aim at. Now, where KidPlan comes in to help you with this is an EBV, which is called the number of kids weaned. Now, it's not brilliant. It's the best we've got, and Sheep Genetics is working on improving it. But what I want to show you here, and I'll show you a few of these graphs, this is simply the number of kids weaned EBV for a whole herd of animals put in order of number of kids weaned. So just while you get your mind around that, this percentage here is 0. That's about the average and the benchmark for the whole, for all goats. 5%, these animals here will give you 5% more kids than that on average. These will give you 10% more. This will give you 15% more. And these ones down this end, which I can't see, will actually deliver you 10 to 15% below benchmark. So the difference between a fairly good sire that comes out of this area and a moderately bad sire which comes out of one of these ones on the right can easily be 20% in kid numbers. And that's what Lowe is referring to. So the careful look at the right EBV and the right buck selection with the right number of kids weaned data can make a massive difference to the number of kids you're going to turn off. The growth rates, this is exactly the same principle, this chart. This happens to be the post-weaning weight, in other words, about 9 months of all the 2021 bucks in KidPlan at the moment. If you went looking for a 2021 buck, you focused on the growth rate, the post-weaning weight kilograms, this is the range of possibilities you would have. The best ones would throw kids which would average at 9 months old 2 to 3 kilos above benchmark, and the ones down here, sorry, I can't see them on my screen, but from memory they're minus 3 or 4. So there's a massive difference in the growth rates of kids which you get from in the difference between selecting a high growth rate sire or dam and a low growth rate sire. Muscling is exactly the same story. I don't want to bore you with it. This is the typical range you get of eye muscle depth in a range of bucks, which you might see in front of you at a sale. And at the sale, of course, what you look at is the condition. That's the skill of the seed stock producer to make him look big and shiny and meaty. But in fact, as others have pointed out, it doesn't actually tell you very much about the genetic merit of producing eye muscle. Here is worm resistance in one mob of our bucks. These are actually the Dormant Park bucks. It always staggers me, this chart, so I just put it up like this. These are raw worm counts, which will come through in the worm egg EBV as well. But these animals have all run together. This is 120 young billies, have all run together identically in the same mob, all pretty much the same age, the same environment. This one here was carrying 3,000 eggs per gram and shedding that one to poison all the other animals on the farm. Now, I've seen cases in other mobs where that was 5,000 or 8,000 this end. His mate, who's running around with him, eating the same grass and eating a whole lot of his dung as well, is running here with 100 or less eggs. In fact, there's some of them here that are 0, so they don't actually show on the chart. So for those who suffer from worms, and I don't have to tell you what drenching goat is like, for those who suffer from that, massive improvements can be made by focusing on worm resistance. Let's go quickly to crossing up. I'm probably running out of time a bit here. The first rule about crossing up, in other words, you start with your rangeland herd and you choose whatever breed and color you want to cross up to, and away you go. Set your breeding objective. The first rule I would advise is the doctor's rule. First, do no harm. You have a business. It's almost certainly a good business. And believe me, crossing up sounds as though it's always going to help you, but I promise you it doesn't always. And it is quite easy to damage your one business. And I want to go back to that first productivity chart I showed you and just tune you in to those dates again. Okay. We started in 1999 back here. And so for the first 8 or 10 years, the productivity of this portion of the herd actually declined. So as the visuals were improving and we were proudly turning off these better looking kids, we thought their production, their growth rate was actually falling. And we didn't know that. We should have, but we were too stupid and we didn't focus on it. Once we started turning it round, it turned very quickly. And the only cause of this blue arrow and all that pain and all that cost was that we started with the wrong bucks. We used bucks which were literally detrimental, below average, and they systematically, progressively, in a compound way, reduced the productivity of our herd. So crossing up can be fantastic, but beware that it actually costs a lot. When it feels as though it's going to be cheap, it costs a lot. There are big decisions to make about whether you want the first, the second, the third cross. And above all, be very, very careful that if you make genetic selections in the early years, you are not actually fostering and covering up, fostering unproductive genetics. So it is quite easy to have better looking animals and a worse business, unless you're really conscious of it. So these are our mistakes. I've tried to put them into some dangerous ideas. I lose friends here always. So this is a common idea. Crossing up will always make my herd more productive. It won't always, it sometimes will. The next dangerous idea is any boer will put more meat on my rangeland nannies. Some of them will, some of them won't. Can I just go to the summary? So there you go. This is what we've learned in 20 years. Crossing up is a long game, can be expensive. Start with visuals, but watch out for the genetics. KidPlan will drive that productivity like crazy. Make sure you start with the right genetics. And what you've got to focus on is reproduction and survival, growth to 1 year, muscling, and worms. Thanks for listening. Sorry I went over time.
No worries at all. That was wonderful, Colin. Thanks very much. It was a very good insight into all of your hard work. Next up, we have Emily Watts. Emily is a Southern Queensland rangeland boar operation breeder. Her goat breeding program utilises boar genetics that's resulted in a more profitable operation and a quicker turnover of commercial kill bucks. Emily believes that by developing a structurally correct, fertile, meat-producing goat to suit those Western conditions, will be highly competitive in other meat-producing animals. So welcome, Emily. Look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Mel. So yeah, we're Catlock Goats. We're a family business. Catlock Goats is a rangeland / boar commercial operation between Dirranbandi and Bolan in Queensland. We have a boar crossbreeding program with our rangeland does, and we've bred our own bucks for a number of years, and we have around 7,000 commercial breeders. Today, what I will present is what we as a family business have done in our eyes to make a more profitable / productive enterprise with goats. These are some measures you as producers may be interested in adopting. We do paddock sales and are involved in the Queensland State Breeders' Sale at Charleville with the aim of selling crossbreds and boars. So by utilising boar genetics, we see a much more profitable operation and quicker turnover of our commercial kill bucks. These are just some averages that we've been hitting, especially last year. With our F1s, we were sort of averaging $180 to $215 a head, around 8 to 12 months of age, 22 to 24 kg skin on. We were pretty happy with those results. At the moment, with all this wet weather around we've had in our season, we've definitely felt that our weights have dropped back a little bit with our kills. Also, some of these weights shown here with the 22 to 24 kg skin on, they are weights finished on crop rotations such as oats with cattle. We have found that as goats run really well on crops, and it's been a big asset for us to be able to do that sort of thing. With our kill dose or commercial dose, this is probably a new area we're trying to explore a bit more. I think at times when the restocker price can go down, we've seen a bit of volatility in the market of late. So we sort of aim to sell adult females to 160 to 180. Probably the other day was the first time we'd sent a load of all females, and they dressed 18 kilos skin on. They were mostly milk. There were some broken tooth ones in them, but they were sort of F1s, $165 a head. And I think it's really a market we're going to have to pursue, and I think that they're very beneficial, and I think it'll be something that we'll definitely look towards for our business. As Lo mentioned before, I was really happy to hear we started semen testing last year. It's an important part of our operation, especially I think, as Colin and Lo have both said, with bucks being prepared sometimes for sales and they might be on rations, that does affect their fertility, and it's not always the biggest and the best. Their fertility does become affected. So we are really big on semen testing, and the organisation that we do use has found within Australia with their goat testing that 10% do fail. So I think it's quite an important part of our operation. Scanning. So we started this last year. It was a big step, and it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of dedication. You know, when you're uncontrolled, bringing in mobs, there's kids on the ground, like it's stressful, but I think it has really reaped a lot of benefits for us. And I think understanding your herd's trends and where you're at, and proving some theories wrong and finding out other theories are right. So some of the general things we've been seeing is our maiden dose. For example, if you join 500, we have found that 650 kids, 125% we found with our goats, 25 to 30% twinning, roughly 15% empty, and a minimum age of 8 months. A set joining from 8 to 10 months is probably more ideal. Autumn and spring kidding, especially spring kidding, I think is the key for our location where we are. I think that is the best time for us to kid. And, you know, like everyone, you know, we did do a join in summer this year because rangeland bucks were jumping into our herd, and we just thought, oh, we'll just join them. They're obviously cycling, and we'll just join them for 6 weeks. And then we brought them into scanning, and it wasn't right. Like, we had a really big learning curve. It wasn't the right time to join. In fact, our scanner said the ones that were in kid were probably just got in kid, or he said by looking at them they were cycling then and there, and that was in April. So pretty much April, May for us, perfect time to be joining to achieve that that spring kidding. So I think that really has sort of set us right. And I also think being able to keep your weaner females separate with your kidding, like, you know, when you bring them in for weaning, if they haven't brought that kid in, that doe is not productive, and it is not to be there for your herd's future, I believe. And it's also probably good to try and look after them as best you can, because I think when I worked on a Brahman stud, if they could have that first calf and then get back into calf again, their fertility was sort of right for the future. And I think if we can be able to have that first kid with our goats and then have them get back into kid is a really good trait, and I think that would be a really good strong fertility trait for the future for our herd. So with our adult females, it's a bit hard at the moment because we're shuffling around and we're scanning at different times. Some are pregnant, some have got kids, but we've been finding around 150% to 200% a year with our kids. I think the theory of them getting straight back into kid, I think at times, and if you're uncontrolled, I think at times it's right, but if the seasons are right for the rangelands, they'll do it. But I think as soon as you pull the weaners off and then you join them, that is when your best success rates are for joining. I don't think from when we were scanning, we would scan a lot of wet ones, but they weren't back into kids. So I think that theory has probably been questioned a bit for us. I think that's probably something we're probably not quite there for. At times when we are scanning, just because it being probably a bit larger scale, as we are scanning, we are doing a class on feet and udders at the same time. Really, really important, like bad teats and udders. They're in rangeland, they're in boars, they're in any breed, and they're not to be there. They are not producing anything for your herd. They are not raising kids. And I think it's a good way to class your herd, especially because within the market that it is now, there is no difference, in price. So for your cull does or your cull bucks, like there's no price in age. So take the opportunity to class your stock with no deduction for the age within the market. I think this is a really good opportunity to do that while you can and receive the full premium price. Yeah, so with our rangelands, I think we're still trying to figure that out with our scanning. Like, they're so fine in tune with nature. We have our bucks out for a certain period of time. Probably for 3 months, we've sort of got ourselves at that sort of bracket at the moment, from scanning our whole herd from fully controlled to semi-controlled at the moment. That's something we're going to try and aim for. We've classed all our rangeland bucks just on a physical selection, just feet, and just getting a sort of rough selection on them. We know for certain that we want rangelands to be the base for our herd. And this year, you know, we are joining rangelands to rangelands and boar crosses to boars, because that rangeland genetic is just so important. And to have a high productive, well-framed, good mothering rangeland animal is just so important to us, especially living in the West. That is just vital to our success and our production. With worms, we are very lucky. We haven't seemed to run into too much trouble there. We do worm tests, but we have a lot of room and we have browse for them. And I think the browse, being able to get up, has been a big success factor with our worms. With stocking rates, we run them basically the same as sheep for our area, but probably a little bit under due to us running cattle at the same time. So 1 goat to 1.2 hectares. So, yeah. Infrastructure. So a lot of thought has gone into this for us, because we know our biggest weakness is collecting data, and that's what we need to get a lot better at. And you need the infrastructure to do it. You're not going to do it properly unless you've got it there, ready to go, ready to set up. It is expensive and it is a cost at the start, but I think the rewards and the outlays will be far better off for the future with it. So we've just invested into ClickX yards, a new Holland stock lifter, and a Prattley auto drafter. This is going to allow us to record on our weights, and the process of DNA collecting for parentage will be a lot easier. So this is our selection at the moment for what we are doing. The infrastructure will allow for the traits of weight gain performance to be measured in the parentage. So our hope to one day will be to be able to have the order, run them into the auto drafter, then come up on their parentage and draft on their weights to their parentage at the same time. I think the structure, the feet, is very important. And then if we can, because we don't have time probably for us to go and tag out at birth to find the parentage, that's why we've gone down the lines of DNA. I think it is a bit of an upfront cost at first, but once you start getting the records and the history on, I think in years to come we'll see a lot of benefits. And being able to measure their weight growth with the auto drafter, just to be able to run them through when it comes to their yearling weights and weaning weights, I think will really improve a lot of benefit to our operation. And once we start getting that process, then we will start looking at the KidPlan and looking down those lines a lot more. We just need to get our data collection right and recording for that to sort of make happen, I think, at the moment. We have undertaken an AI program with Winfield Boars, who has sourced genetics from stud Nico Boother in South Africa. We see a big advantage using these genetics, especially to add more rump to our goats, because I think that's where we're lacking the most, and that's where we need to see our biggest improvement, especially to increase our carcass weights, a lot more meat down the back. And we've also purchased some contender bucks, which have boar, rangeland, and mytonic in their bloodlines. It's a great cross to go over our rangeland does. I think that's going to add a lot more benefit and meat to our production. So at the end of the day, as a business, we want to add more kg to the carcass. For us, we see that colour isn't being offered as a premium when you go to the abattoir and the markets. We feel if we can add depth and width over to the hips and backs, we will add more profit to our operation. We are very commercially orientated, and we feel if we can develop a structurally correct, fertile, meat-producing animal to suit Western conditions, it will be one to really compete with other meat-producing animals for the future. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Great presentation, Emily. That was a really insightful look into your business and what you're doing on farm and how you're using genetics to further gain the productivity in your own herds. I'd just like to take the opportunity for everyone to put some questions in the Q&A. We've noticed that there's a couple that have come through already, which is wonderful. So we might just get going with the first question, which is to you, Peter. I noticed in the chat that you said that you'll address the first one, and that was, there doesn't seem to be many bucks in the sheep genetics search database. If you select have progeny more than one flock and progeny in current drop, then the search returns $0. Is there an opportunity for goat resource flocks so that bucks from studs are not currently using KidPlan can be evaluated, increasing the number of goats with known genetic performance?
Yeah, thanks, Mel. And I know Pete's had to drop off now, but I think it's a really good question. And I'm sure I can draw on experience from Colin here as well. So when Pete says that you can do that search he did, so goats that are used in more than one herd, and that's not returning any results. And that's spot on. I replicated the search and got exactly the same thing. I think it's a really important aspect to comment on, though, is something that really underpins our genetic evaluation for KidPlan is what we call linkage. So linkage is the use of common genes or a common sire across different environments. So different breeders using that common buck. And that allows us, that common buck, you put him across multiple environments and you can benchmark all the other sires that you're using in that year as well. So yeah, a reference population or resource flock's a great way to go about building that. And Mel, you know more about what's happening in that space than I do. But I guess from a genetics KidPlan perspective, there is stuff you can do now, and that's to share genes. So I think, Colin, there was a program a couple of years ago, wasn't there, where we bit of a young sire program and some bucks were shared around, and that really underpins the linkage and allows us to create breeding values that can be compared across flock. So there's a good opportunity for goat breeders or anyone that's currently in KidPlan or is looking to get into KidPlan as a seed stock producer to be talking to other producers and sharing common genetics of bucks, and that will really, it's a key step to getting involved in KidPlan. So then your herd can be benchmarked against others that are in the analysis. So the resource or reference population is one way of doing it, but also sharing genetics among other breeders that are part of KidPlan is the other way to do that. So Mel or Colin, I don't know if you want to comment more on that.
Yes, I can do a quick comment if I may, Mel.
Yeah, definitely go for it, Colin, because it segues nicely into a follow-up question that we have.
I'm a bit surprised that you've got no bucks with kids in multiple herds, because there definitely are some. Maybe
I think
the
it was
parameters,
current drop. So
current drop, yes, there wouldn't be there, but there is a bit of linkage happening in the background. The other point I would make about it is that there are a lot of potential seed stock producers who actually have quite a lot of data, and we need to get them to know that by getting some linkage with an existing indexed animal into those herds, they can very, very rapidly get indexation throughout their animals if they feel like joining KidPlan. So I think that's a point which is frequently missed, and it's could be quite powerful.
Yeah, great point there, Colin. There was a nice question that came through which segues really nicely and builds on part of your response there, Peter. It was about what producers were used for the MLA buck trial, and are those results still available? Colin, did you want to expand on that and address that question?
The answer is yes. There are certainly descendants and possibly semen of some of those animals available. The bucks came from, it was in 2013, so it was a while ago, but they came from Tambuki, from Terrawena, from Judorman Park, I think from Terra Mac, from Cadenza. I've probably lost, but I think there were 6 different studs that provided 8 or 9 different sires. That information is all fully reported in the MLA reports, and anybody who wants to get hold of it should be able to find it there.
Great. Emily, did you want to add on anything from?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we actually used semen from the bucks in that trial last year with the Winfield Boar stud that we actually used semen that those bucks were used in. I just thought I'd add that. So the semen is still available, yes.
I'm sorry, I forgot Winfield. That should have been included.
No, that's all right, Colin. Yeah.
We have another question that's popped into the Q&A, and this one was for you again, Colin. It was in regards to why the drop in the YEMD in 2015 to 2016. So that was one of the graphs that you showed in your presentation.
Why did it drop?
Yes. Why did it drop?
Because at that time, we were focusing on growth rates, and we elected to use sires with higher growth rates but lower eye muscle depth. And as you would know, some of these traits are antagonistic anyway. I think growth rates and eye muscle depth actually correlate rather than being antagonistic. But if you choose to use sires and sacrifice a bit of eye muscle depth, you're going to fall back in that area.
Well answered there, Colin. We've got another one that's come through. It says, where did the base data for KidPlan come from? And is there a process to check the integrity of the data sent from producers for entry to KidPlan?
Yeah, so regarding the I guess the base data, and a lot of the data that's supplied to KidPlan has been supplied by seedstock breeders themselves. So Colin's spoken about his experience tonight. We have other members as well. Regarding the quality checks, all files or data that's submitted by breeders is checked. So for example, and we have quality assurance procedures around all our data. So for example, eye muscle and fat scans, that must be done by a sheep genetics accredited scanner. So they're accredited to scan both flocks and herds for fat and muscle. And to pass that accreditation, we actually do a number of repeatabilities and correlation to CT machines to make sure that they're actually measuring muscle and fat on the animal. The data that's submitted to KidPlan, it's got to be recorded within particular age ranges, and we do look at the data and go, okay, there's been weaning weights submitted, and there's a buck in here at 110 kilos. That's outside the range of what we'd expect. So we have those ranges that we kick out data that's wrong or outside what would be expected as the normal distribution for a population. So there's a whole range of checks that goes on to the data that's being submitted by breeders into KidPlan. It is very difficult, and people often go, oh, would someone cheat the system? We're always looking at the data. We're looking at what data is changing between different submissions. So we do pick up on that. And really, if there is anyone fudging the system, you're only fudging yourself, because that breeding value is not going to reflect the genetic merit of that animal. And that's going to bias your selection, and you're not going to get the genetic gain. So it's in the breeder's best interest to submit that good quality data. Plus, we're also doing other quality assurance checks.
Great, thanks, Peter. There's a question that's actually come through the chat, and I think I'll let Lo answer this one. It was, when can we expect a report on the KidPlan research that was conducted with University of Queensland?
Thanks for that one. Yes, I think the final report should be available for the public in about 6 weeks' time. I've left we are looking for a few more respondents. So we've left the questionnaire open for another 2 weeks. So it closes on the 16th. So it's 1 more week to go. And then we'll be analyzing the full data. But I would appreciate it if more people could give their inputs. You don't have to. One of the questions is, do you understand what an estimated breeding value is? And if you say no, that's actually, if you don't know, but saying you don't know strengthens the responses that I get, because that means that I can then go to MLA and say, we got to have more workshops around this and that. And for the goat producers, there's a couple of questions that actually go around and specifically ask, what information would you like MLA to give to you as producers? The questionnaire should take you less than 10 minutes to fill in. I think Emily did it the other day. She says it took her 10 minutes. It's very user friendly. It can be filled in from your cell phone and or from your computer. And I would really like people to use this opportunity, because every response is a positive response in that it gives us direction where we need to go within MLA and the whole KidPlan. So it's not just about KidPlan. That's only a small part for the commercial producers. It's about things like, do you have a breeding season, a mating season or not? What do you think is important for you or not? How do you sell your goat? So it's a lot of general information, because we find we don't have a lot of information about what's actually happening on the ground. And when we know what's happening on the ground, this will direct where the research should be going. That was a long, long answer to a short question.
No, it was a good response there, Lo. I've got 2 last questions. One for Emily. I think this would be a good one for you. It was, do you have a data collection protocol, i.e. which data and when should it be submitted and collected?
Yeah, thanks, Mel. So we're still in the stages of building our new yards and everything, but we are going with TrueTest. That connects best with the auto drafter with the brand Pratley. And our data collection is, we want to know the fertility history of our stud stock does, so record their fertility history, and then the progeny that comes out of them, get their parentage, and then when they wean, get their weaning weights, and then I'm still working out, I'm not quite sure how long it is after your weaning weight you should weigh them again. Colin would know that probably better than me, and then also get a yearling weight. And I think those are probably the main traits we want to record at the moment for us. I think parentage and weights are the 2 keys for us at the moment.
Yeah, great. Colin, did you want to add anything on that about a data collection protocol?
Emily's exactly right. The first part of the answer is that the more data you choose to collect, the more accurate results you get. But if you're just getting the whole thing started, you basically have to have parentage, and then you should probably have 2 weights, either weaning weight or a post-weaning weight, and that'll be quite enough to start giving you some numbers.
Can I come in here? One of the most important things is, I did mention it, but I want to reiterate it, and that is, you need a ID of the individual animals. That's quite important to capture. It sounds simple, but that's what you need. And the other one is the type of tag that you use is important, because a lot of the tags, remember, the goats stick their heads in the weirdest bushes and weirdest places. So they do break off a lot of tags. We find, from speaking to a whole range of producers, it seems like round tags seem to be better, particularly those that are give off RFID tags, because that automatically then picks up the number when you start doing the auto drafting and and the skulls and that. I don't know, Emily, if you want to come in on that one, what's been your experience with tags?
Yeah, well, Colin will know as well a lot more, but yeah, we're going, I forgot to mention EID, we're going with the little Orflex wraparound tag, and then we are going with the Orflex. They're like little cattle tags, so you can read their numbers and link their number tag to their EID tag, which then can go onto your data collection system of True Test. And then if you have a handler, you can just put them in the handler and scan them with your wand and take the TSU sample for the DNA, and then it will connect to your data collector, and that's how we're aiming to do our parentage collection, etc. sort of thing.
Perfect. We've got one last question that we might pop up, and that was a boar stud breeder. As a boar stud breeder, it's disappointing to hear that Colin found that full blood boars were a mistake for him. Was there a reason that you did not try another producer and to move to crossbred bucks? What did you cross them with? So did you want to just clarify on that a little bit, Colin, and address that question?
What we did after quite a few years was start running our full-blood bucks with our crossbred bucks, all running identically, and getting comparative data on all of them. And then we were monitoring the EBVs and the performance of all of them equally and comparatively. And what started to happen is that the purebreds, which are basically infused, just started showing better and better numbers. We ignored that for a long time, and then it became so different, such a difference, that we just had to accept it. It was too important. So that's where we are now. It cost us, our clients who want full-blood bucks, we still provide bucks for them. We still do run full-bloods, but we can't ever claim that they are productively the best. I hope and wish that there are highly productive full-blood bucks out there. All I can say is that we never managed to find them. I hope somebody else does.
I guess on those comments as well, Colin, an experience that we've seen in sheep where we have multi-breed evaluations, a bit like in goats, where we're running all our terminal animals together so we can compare white Suffolks, Poll Dorsets, all the different breeds on the same set of EBVs. There's no one breed that's better than the other. We see that there's as much variation within a breed as across breeds. But I guess the goats at the moment, the pivotal or key message is we don't know that unless they're recorded. So we can hopefully identify those that are good of a particular breed and of other breeds. We just need to know about them, and we need them recorded in KidPlan so we can find those outliers and find those good ones and take advantage of them.
I think that's critically important, Peter. And a point I should have made myself was that the genetic spread within a breed is probably equal to the genetic spread between breeds. So personally, I don't really care whether your base animal is a red or a Kalahari or a stout, whatever it is, I don't mind. Because what's going to make the difference at the end of the day is its genetic merit. Better to choose a good one from one breed than insist on being in a particular breed.
We have one last question that's come in, and I think it would be of interest to a lot of people on this webinar tonight. So we might quickly answer this just before wrapping up. And it was, Drench-resistant worms is a risk when introducing new genetics. What steps do you suggest to preventing introducing these worms when bringing in new animals? Colin, do you want to wrap this one up for us? You've got lots of experience.
It's absolutely a risk. There's no question. The first thing is to understand the environment they come from, because that will give you a first indication of whether they're likely to be wormy or not. And so be careful. Transferring an animal from one environment to another one is always risky. As a matter of principle, I would drench on, it's called drench on, every single animal that comes onto our place. And ideally, I would lock it up in a small yard on its own for as many days as you can manage. Often we can't actually achieve that, but in practice, that's what you should do, and give it a really thorough drenching.
Great, thank you. Well, I just wanted to do a big thank you to all of our presenters tonight. I think you all did a wonderful job of presenting on goat genetics, and it was great to have you part of this goat series of Goat Roadshow webinar. Just beforehand, before everyone leaves this webinar, can I please suggest that you go down to the chat and fill out our feedback on today's session? It'd be great to see what you thought about each of our speakers and also the content for today. Get some valuable feedback. So thank you very much, everyone, for jumping on, and thank you again to all of our presenters.